Th 120 Days of Sodom, or the School of Licentiousness, Les 120 Journées de Sodome au École du Libertinage, is a novel by the French writer and nobleman Donatien Alphonse Francois, Marquis de Sade, written in 1785. It tells the story of four wealthy male libertines who resolve to experience the ultimate sexual gratification in orgies. To do this, they seal themselves away for 4 months in an inaccessible castle with a harem of 46 victims, mostly young male and females, and engage 4 women brothel keepers to tell the stories of their lives and adventures. The women's narratives form an inspiration for the sexual abuse and torture of the victims, which gradually mounts in intensity and ends in their slaughter. The work remained unpublished until the 20th century. In recent times it has been translated into many languages, including English, Japanese, and German. Due to its themes of sexual violence and extreme cruelty, it has frequently been banned. Introduction to the extensive wars wherewith Louis XIV was burdened during his reign, while draining the state's treasury and exhausting the substance of the people, nonetheless contain the secret that led to the prosperity of a swarm of those bloodsuckers who are always on the watch for public calamities, which, instead of appeasing, they promote or invent so as, precisely, to be able to profit from them the more advantageously. The end of this so very sublime reign was perhaps one of the periods in the history of the French Empire when one saw the emergence of the greatest number of these mysterious fortunes whose origins are as obscure as the lust and debauchery that accompany them. It was toward the close of this period, and not long before the regent sought, by means of the famous tribunal which goes under the name of the Chamber de Justice, to flush this multitude of traffickers, that 4 of them conceived the idea for the singular revels whereof we are going to give an account. One must not suppose that it was exclusively the low-born and vulgar sort which did this swindling. Gentlemen of the highest note led the pack. The Duc de Blangus and his brother the Bishop of Aix, each of whom had thuswise amassed immense fortunes, are in themselves solid proof that, like the others, the nobility neglected no opportunities to take this road to wealth. These 2 illustrious figures, through their pleasures and business closely associated with the celebrated Durset and the President de Courval, were the first to hit upon the debauch we propose to chronicle, and having communicated the scheme to their 2 friends, all 4 agreed to assume the major roles in these unusual orgies. For above 6 years these 4 libertines, kindred through their wealth and tastes, had thought to strengthen their ties by means of alliances in which debauchery had by far a heavier part than any of the other motives that ordinarily serve as a basis for such bonds. What they arranged was as follows: the Duc de Blangus, thrice a widower and sire of 2 daughters one wife had given him, having noticed that the President de Courval appeared interested in marrying the elder of these girls, despite the familiarities he knew perfectly well her father had indulged in with her, the Duc, I say, suddenly conceived the idea of a triple alliance. "You want Julie for your wife," said he to Courval, "I give her to you unhesitatingly and put but one condition to the match, that you'll not be jealous when, although your wife, she continues to show me the same complaisance she always has in the past. What is more, I'd have you lend your voice to mine in persuading our good Durset to give me his daughter Constance, for whom, I must confess, I have developed roughly the same feelings you have formed for Julie." "But," said Courval, "you are surely aware that Durset, just as libertine as you." "I know all that's to be known," the Duc rejoined. "In this age, and with our manner of thinking, is one halted by such things? Do you think I seek a wife in order to have a mistress? I want a wife that my whims may be served. I want her to veil, to cover an infinite number of little secret debauches the cloak of marriage wonderfully conceals. In a word, I want her for the reasons you want my daughter. Do you fancy I am ignorant of your object and desires? We libertines wed women to hold slaves. As wives they are rendered more submissive than mistresses, and you know the value we set upon despotism in the joys we pursue." It was at this point Durset entered. His 2 friends related their conversation and, delighted by an overture which promptly induced him to avow the sentiments he too had conceived for Adelaide, the President's, Dorset accepted the Dew as his son-in-law, provided he might become Curville's. The three marriages were speedily concluded, the dowries were immense, the wedding contracts identical. No less culpable than his two colleagues, the President had admitted to Dorset, who betrayed no displeasure upon learning it, that he maintained a little clandestine commerce with his own daughter. The three fathers, each wishing not only to preserve his rights, but noticing here the possibility of extending them, commonly agreed that the three young ladies, bound to their husbands by goods and homes only, would not in body belong more to one than to any of them, and the severest punishments were prescribed for her who should take it into her head not to comply with any of the conditions whereunto she was subject. They were on the eve of realizing their plan when the Bishop of X, already close-bound through pleasure shared with his brother's two friends, proposed contributing a fourth element to the alliance should the other three gentlemen consent to his participation in the affair. This element, the Dew's second daughter and hence the bishop's niece, was already more thoroughly his property than was generally imagined. He had effected connections with his sister-in-law, and the two brothers knew beyond all shadow of doubt that the existence of this maiden, who was called Aline, was far more accurately to be ascribed to the bishop than to the Dew, the former who, from the time she left the cradle, had taken the girl into his keeping, had not, as one may well suppose, stood idle as the years brought her charms to flower. And so, upon this head, he was his colleague's equal, and the article he offered to put on the market was in an equal degree damaged or degraded, but as Aline's attractions and tender youth outshone even those of her three companions, she was unhesitatingly made a part of the bargain. As had the other three, the bishop yielded her up, but retained the rights to her use, and so each of our four characters thus found himself husband to four wives. Thus there resulted an arrangement which, for the reader's convenience, we shall recapitulate. The Dew, Julie's father, became the husband of Constance, Dorset's daughter. Dorset, Constance's father, became the husband of Adelaide, the President's daughter. The President, Adelaide's father, became the husband of Julie, the Dew's elder daughter, and the bishop, Aline's uncle and father, became the husband of the other three females by ceding this same Aline to his friends, the while retaining the same rights over her. It was at a superb estate of the Dew, situated in the Bourbonnais, that these happy matches were made, and I leave to the reader to fancy how they were consummated and in what orgies. Obliged as we are to describe others, we shall forego the pleasure of picturing these. Upon their return to Paris, our four friends' association became only the firmer, and as our next task is to make the reader familiar with them, before proceeding to individual and more searching developments, a few details of their lubricious arrangements will serve, it seems to me, to shed a preliminary light upon the character of these debauchees. The society had created a common fund, which each of its members took his turn administering for 6 months. The sums, allocated for nothing but expenses in the interests of pleasure, were vast. Their excessive wealth put the most unusual things within their reach, and the reader ought not be surprised to hear that 2 million were annually dispersed to obtain good cheer and lust satisfaction. 4 accomplished procuresses to recruit women, and a similar number of pimps to scout out men, had the sole duty to range both the capital and the provinces and bring back everything, in the one gender and in the other, that could best satisfy their sensuality's demands. 4 supper parties were held regularly every week in 4 different country houses located at 4 extremities of Paris. At the first of these gatherings, the one exclusively given over to the pleasures of sodomy, only men were present. There would always be at hand 16 young men, ranging in age from 20 to 30, whose immense faculties permitted our 4 heroes, in feminine guise, to taste the most agreeable delights. The youths were selected solely upon the basis of the size of their member, and it almost became necessary that this superb limb be of such magnificence that it could never have penetrated any woman. This was an essential clause, and as naught was spared by way of expense, only very rarely would it fail to be fulfilled? But simultaneously to sample every pleasure, to these 16 husbands was joined the same quantity of boys, much younger, whose purpose was to assume the office of women. These lads were from 12 to 18 years old, and to be chosen for service each had to possess a freshness, a face, graces, charms, an air, an innocence, a candor which are far beyond what our brush could possibly paint. No woman was admitted to these masculine orgies, in the course of which everything of the lewdest invented in Sodom and Gomorrah was executed. At the second supper were girls of superior class who, upon these occasions forced to give up their proud ostentation and the customary insolence of their bearing, were constrained, in return for their hire, to abandon themselves to the most irregular caprices, and often even to the outrages our libertines were pleased to inflict upon them. 12 of these girls would appear, and as Paris could not have furnished a fresh supply of them as often as would have been necessary, these evenings were interspersed with others at which were admitted, only in the same number as the well-bred ladies, women ranging from procuresses up through the class of officers' wives. There are above 4,000 or 5,000 in Paris who belong to one or the other of the two latter classes and whom need or lust obliges to attend soirees of this kind. One has but to have good agents to find them, and our libertines, who were splendidly represented, would frequently come across miraculous specimens. But it was in vain one was honest or a decent woman, one had to submit everything. Our lordship's libertinage, of a variety that never brooks limits, would overwhelm with horrors and infamies whatever, whether by nature or social convention, ought to have been exempt from such ordeals. Once one was there, one had to be ready for anything, and as our four villains had every taste that accompanies the lowest, most crapulous debauch, this fundamental acquiescence to their desires was not by any means a matter of inconsequence. The guests at the third supper were the vilest, foulest creatures that can possibly be met with. To him who has some acquaintance with debauchery's extravagances, this refinement will appear wholly understandable. 'Tis most voluptuous to wallow, so to speak, in filth with persons of this category. These exercises offer the completest abandon, the most monstrous intemperance, the most total abasement, and these pleasures, compared with those tasted the evening before, or with the distinguished individuals in whose company we have tasted them, have a way of lending a sharp spice to earlier activities. At these third suppers, debauch being more thorough, nothing was omitted that might render it complex and piquant. 100 whores would appear in the course of 6 hours, and only too often something less than the full 100 would leave the games. But there is nothing to be gained by hurrying our story or by broaching subjects which can only receive adequate treatment in the sequel. As for the fourth supper, it was reserved for young maids, only those between the ages of 7 and 15 were permitted. Their condition in life was of no importance, what counted was their looks. They had to be charming. As for their virginity, authentic evidence was required. Oh, incredible refinement of libertinage! It was not, assuredly, that they wished to pluck all those roses, and how indeed could they have done so? For those untouched flowers were always a score in number, and of our 4 libertines only 2 were capable of proceeding to the act. One of the remaining 2, the financier, being absolutely incapable of an erection, and the bishop being absolutely unable to take his pleasure save in a fashion which, yes, I agree, may dishonor a virgin but which, however, always leaves her perfectly intact. No matter, the 20 maidenheads had to be there, and those which were not impaired by our quartet of masters became, before their eyes, the prey of certain of their valets just as depraved as they, whom they kept constantly at beck and call for more than one reason. Apart from these 4 supper parties there was another, a secret and private one held every Friday, involving many fewer persons but surely costing a great deal more. The participants were restricted to 4 young and high-born damsels who, by means of strategy and money, had been abducted from their parents' homes. Our libertines' wives nearly always had a share in this debauch, and their extreme submissiveness, their docile attentions, their services made it more of a success each time. As for the genial atmosphere at these suppers, it goes without saying that even greater profusion than delicacy reigned there. Not one of these meals cost less than 10,000 francs, and neighboring countries as well as all France were ransacked so that what was of the rarest and most exquisite might be assembled together. Fine and abundant wines and liqueurs were there, and even during the winter they had fruits of every season. In a word, one may be certain that the table of the world's greatest monarch was not dressed with as much luxury nor served with equal magnificence. But now let us retrace our steps and do our best to portray one by one each of our four heroes, to describe each not in terms of the beautiful, not in a manner that would seduce or captivate the reader, but simply with the brush strokes of nature which, despite all her disorder, is often sublime, indeed even when she is at her most depraved. For and why not say so in passing, if crime lacks the kind of delicacy one finds in virtue, is not the former always more sublime? Does it not unfailingly have a character of grandeur and sublimity which surpasses, and will always make it preferable to, the monotonous and lackluster charms of virtue? Will you protest the greater usefulness of this or of that? Is it for us to scan nature's laws, ours to determine whether, vice being just as necessary to nature as is virtue, she perhaps does not implant in us, in equal quantity, the penchant for one or the other, depending upon her respective needs? But let us proceed. The Duc de Blangus, at 18 the master of an already colossal fortune which his later speculations much increased, experienced all the difficulties which descend like a cloud of locusts upon a rich and influential young man who need not deny himself anything. It almost always happens in such cases that the extent of one's vices, and one stints oneself that much less the more one has the means to procure oneself everything. Had the Duc received a few elementary qualities from nature, they might possibly have counterbalanced the dangers which beset him in his position, but this curious mother, who sometimes seems to collaborate with chance in order that the latter may favor every vice she gives to those certain beings of whom she expects attentions very different from those virtue supposes, and this because she has just as much need of the one as of the other. Nature, I say, in destining Blangus for immense wealth, had meticulously endowed him with every impulse, every inspiration required for its abuse. Together with a tenebrous and very evil mind, she had accorded him a heart of flint and an utterly criminal soul, and these were accompanied by the disorders in tastes and irregularity of whim whence were born the dreadful libertinage to which the Duc was in no common measure addicted. Born treacherous, harsh, imperious, barbaric, selfish, as lavish in the pursuit of pleasure as miserly when it were a question of useful spending, a liar, a gourmand, a drunk, a dastard, a sodomite, fond of incest, given to murdering, to arson, to theft. No, not a single virtue compensated that host of vices. Why, what am I saying? Not only did he never so much as dream of a single virtue, he beheld them all with horror, and he was frequently heard to say that to be truly happy in this world a man ought not merely fling himself into every vice, but should never permit himself one virtue, and that it was not simply a matter of always doing evil, but also and above all of never doing good. Oh, there are plenty of people, the Duc used to observe, who never misbehave save when passion spurs them to ill. Later, the fire gone out of them, their now calm spirit peacefully returns to the path of virtue and, thus passing their life going from strife to error and from error to remorse, they end their days in such a way there is no telling just what roles they have enacted on earth. Such persons, he would continue, must surely be miserable, forever drifting, continually undecided. Their entire life is spent detesting in the morning what they did the evening before. Certain to repent of the pleasures they taste, they take their delight in quaking. In such sort they become at once virtuous in crime and criminal in virtue. However, our hero would add, my more solid character is a stranger to these contradictions. I do my choosing without hesitation, and as I am always sure to find pleasure in the choice I make, never does regret arise to dull its charm. Firm in my principles because those I formed are sound and were formed very early, I always act in accordance with them. They have made me understand the emptiness and nullity of virtue. I hate virtue, and never will I be seen resorting to it. They have persuaded me that through vice alone is man capable of experiencing this moral and physical vibration which is the source of the most delicious voluptuousness, so I give myself over to vice. I was still very young when I learned to hold religion's fantasies in contempt, being perfectly convinced that the existence of a creator is a revolting absurdity in which not even children continue to believe. I have no need to thwart my inclinations in order to flatter some god. These instincts were given me by nature, and it would be to irritate her were I to resist them. If she gave me bad ones, that is because they were necessary to her designs. I am in her hands but a machine which she runs as she likes, and not one of my crimes does not serve her. The more she urges me to commit them, the more of them she needs. I should be a fool to disobey her. Thus, nothing but the law stands in my way, but I defy the law. My gold and my prestige keep me well beyond reach of those vulgar instruments of repression which should be employed only upon the common sort. If one were to raise the objection that, nevertheless, all men possess ideas of the just and the unjust which can only be the product of nature, since these notions are found in every people and even amongst the uncivilized, the Jew would reply affirmatively, saying that yes, those ideas have never been anything if not relative, that the stronger has always considered exceedingly just what the weaker regarded as flagrantly unjust, and that it takes no more than the mere reversal of their positions for each to be able to change his way of thinking too, whence the Jew would conclude that nothing is really just but what makes for pleasure, and what is unjust is the cause of pain, that in taking 100 louis from a man's pocket, he was doing something very just for himself, although the victim of the robbery might have to regard the action with another eye, that all these notions therefore being very arbitrary, a fool he who would allow himself to become their thrall. It was by means of arguments in this kind the Jew used to justify his transgressions, and as he was a man of greatest possible wit, his arguments had a decisive ring. And so, modeling his conduct upon his philosophy, the Jew had, from his most tender youth, abandoned himself unrestrainedly to the most shameful extravagances, and to the most extraordinary ones. His father, having died young and, as I indicated, left him in control of a huge fortune, had however stipulated in his will that the young man's mother should, while she lived, be allowed to enjoy a large share of this legacy. Such a condition was not in displeasing Blangus, poison appearing to be the only way to avoid having to subscribe to this article, the knave straightway decided to make use of it. But this was the period when he was only making his first steps in a vicious career. Not daring to act himself, he brought one of his sisters, with whom he was carrying on a criminal intrigue, to take charge of the execution, assuring her that if she were to succeed, he would see to it that she would be the beneficiary of that part of the fortune whereof death would deprive their mother. However, the young lady was horrified by this proposal, and the Jew, observing that this ill-confided secret was perhaps going to betray him, decided on the spot to extend his plans to include the sister he had hoped to have for an accomplice. He conducted both women to one of his properties whence the two unfortunate ones never returned. Nothing quite encourages as does one's first unpunished crime. This hurdle once cleared, an open field seemed to beckon to the Jew. Immediately any person whomsoever showed opposition to his desires, poison was employed forthwith. From necessary murders he soon passed to those of pure pleasure. He was captivated by that regrettable folly which causes us to find delight in the sufferings of others. He noticed that a violent commotion inflicted upon any kind of an adversary is answered by a vibrant thrill in our own nervous system. The effect of this vibration, arousing the animal spirits which flow within these nerves concavities, obliges them to exert pressure on the erector nerves and to produce in accordance with this perturbation what is termed a lubricious sensation. Consequently, he set about committing 10 thefts and murders in the name of debauchery and libertinage, just as someone else would be content, in order to inflame these same passions, to chase a whore or two. At the age of 23, he and 3 of his companions in vice, whom he had indoctrinated with his philosophy, made up a party whose aim was to go out and stop a public coach on the highway, to rape the men among the travelers along with the women, to assassinate them afterward, to make off with their victims' money. The conspirators certainly had no need of this, and to be back that same night, all 3 of them, at the opera ball in order to have a sound alibi. This crime took place, yes, 2 charming maids were violated and massacred in their mother's arms. To this was joined an endless list of other horrors, and no one dared suspect the Jew. Weary of the delightful wife his father had bestowed upon him before dying, the young Blangus wasted no time uniting her shade to his mother's, to his sisters, and to those of all his other victims. Why all this? To be able to marry a girl, wealthy, to be sure, but publicly dishonored, and whom he knew full well was her brother's mistress. The person in question was the mother of Aline, one of the figures in our novel we mentioned above. This second wife, soon sacrificed like the first, gave way to a third, who followed hard on the heels of the second. It was rumored abroad that the Jew's huge construction was responsible for the undoing of all his wives, and as this gigantic tale corresponded in every point to its gigantic inspiration, the Jew let the opinion take root and veil the truth. That dreadful colossus did indeed make one think of Hercules or a centaur. Blangus stood 5 foot 11 inches tall, had limbs of great strength and energy, powerful sinews, elastic nerves, in addition to that a proud and masculine visage, great dark eyes, handsome black eyelashes, an aquiline nose, fine teeth, a quality of health and exuberance, broad shoulders, a heavy chest but a well-proportioned figure withal, splendid hips, superb buttocks, the handsomest leg in the world, an iron temperament, the strength of a horse, the member of a veritable mule, wondrously hirsute, blessed with the ability to eject its sperm any number of times within a given day and at will, even at the age of 50, which was his age at the time, a virtually constant erection in this member whose dimensions were an exact 8 inches for circumference and 12 for length overall, and there you have the portrait of the Duc de Blangus, drawn as accurately as if you'd wielded the pencil yourself. But if this masterpiece of nature was violent in its desires, what was it like? Great God! When crowned by drunken and voluptuousness, 'twas a man no longer, 'twas a raging tiger. Woe unto him who happened then to be serving its passions. Frightful cries, atrocious blasphemies sprang from the Duc's swollen breast, flames seemed to dart from his eyes, he foamed at the mouth, he whinnied like a stallion. You'd have taken him for the very god of lust. Whatever then was his manner of having his pleasure, his hands necessarily strayed, roamed continually, and he had been more than once seen to strangle woman to death at the instant of his perfidious discharge. His presence of mind once restored, his frenzy was immediately replaced by the most complete indifference to the infamies wherewith he had just indulged himself, and of this indifference, of this kind of apathy, further sparks of lechery would be born almost at once. In his youth, the Duc had been known to discharge as often as 18 times a day, and that without appearing one jot more fatigued after the final than after the initial ejaculation. 7 or 8 crises within the same interval still held no terrors for him, his half a century of years notwithstanding. For roughly 25 years he had accustomed himself to passive sodomy, and he withstood its assaults with the identical vigor characterized his manner of delivering them actively when, the very next moment, it pleased him to exchange roles. He had once wagered he could sustain 55 attacks in a day, and so he had. Furnished, as we have pointed out, with prodigious strength, he needed only one hand to violate a girl, and he had proved it upon several occasions. One day he boasted he could squeeze the life out of a horse with his legs. He mounted the beast, it collapsed at the instant he had predicted. His prowess at the table outshone, if that is possible, what he demonstrated upon the bed. There's no imagining what had come to be the quantity of the food he consumed. He regularly ate 3 meals a day, and they were all 3 exceedingly prolonged and exceedingly copious, and it was as nothing to him to toss down his usual 10 bottles of Burgundy. He had drunk up to 30, and needed but to be challenged and he would set out for the mark of 50, but his intoxication taking on the tinge of his passions, and liqueurs or wines having heated his brain, he would wax furious, and they would be obliged to tie him down. And despite all that, would you believe it? A steadfast child might have hurled this giant into a panic. True indeed it is that the spirit often poorly corresponds with the fleshy sheath enveloping it. As soon as Blangus discovered he could no longer use his treachery or his deceit to make away with his enemy, he would become timid and cowardly, and the mere thought of even the mildest combat, but fought on equal terms, would have sent him fleeing to the ends of the earth. He had nevertheless, in keeping with custom, been in 1 or 2 campaigns, but had acquitted himself so disgracefully he had retired from the service at once. Justifying his turpitude with equal amounts of cleverness and effrontery, he loudly proclaimed that his poltroonery being nothing other than the desire to preserve himself, it were perfectly impossible for anyone in his right senses to condemn it for a fault. Keep in mind the identical moral traits, next, adapt them to an entity from the physical point of view infinitely inferior to the one we just described. There you have the portrait of the Bishop of X, the Duc de Blangus brother. The same black soul, the same penchant for crime, the same contempt for religion, the same atheism, the same deception and cunning, a yet more supple and adroit mind, however, and more art in guiding his victims to their doom, but a slender figure, not heavy, no, a little thin body, wavering health, very delicate nerves, a greater fastidiousness in the pursuit of pleasure, mediocre prowess, a most ordinary member, even small, but deft, profoundly skilled in management, each time yielding so little that his incessantly inflamed imagination would render him capable of tasting delight quite as frequently as his brother. His sensations were of a remarkable acuteness, he would experience an irritation so prodigious he would often fall into a deep swoon upon discharging, and he almost always temporarily lost consciousness when doing so. He was 45, had delicate features, rather attractive eyes but a foul mouth and ugly teeth, a hairless pallid body, a small but well-shaped ass, and a prick 5 inches around and 6 in length. An idolater of active and passive sodomy, but eminently of the latter, he spent his life having himself buggered, and this pleasure, which never requires much expense of energy, was best suited to the modesty of his means. We will speak of his other tastes in good time. With what regards those of the table, he carried them nearly as far as the Duc, but went about the matter with somewhat more sensuality. Monseigneur, no less a criminal than his elder brother, possessed characteristics which had doubtless permitted him to match the celebrated feats of the hero we painted a moment ago. We will content ourselves with citing one of them. 'Twill be enough to make the reader see of what such a man may be capable, and what he was prepared and disposed to do. Having done the following, one of his friends, a man powerful and rich, had formerly had an intrigue with a young noblewoman who had borne him 2 children, a girl and a boy. He had, however, never been able to wed her, and the maiden had become another's wife. The unlucky girl's lover died while still young, but the owner howbeit of a tremendous fortune, having no kin to provide for, it occurred to him to bequeath all he had to the 2 ill-fated children his affair had produced. On his deathbed, he made the bishop privy to his intentions and entrusted him with these 2 immense endowments. He divided the sum, put them in 2 purses, and gave them to the bishop, confiding the 2 orphans' education to this man of God and enlisting him to pass on to each what was to be his when they attained their majority. At the same time he enjoined the prelate to invest his ward's funds, so that in the meantime they would double in size. He also affirmed that it was his design to leave his offspring's mother in eternal ignorance of what he was doing for them, and he absolutely insisted that none of this should ever be mentioned to her. These arrangements concluded, the dying man closed his eyes, and Monseigneur found himself master of about 1 million in bank notes, and of 2 children. The scoundrel was not long deliberating his next step. The dying man had spoken to no one but him, the mother was to know nothing, the children were only 4 or 5 years old. He circulated the intelligence that his friend, upon expiring, had left his fortune to the poor. The rascal acquired it the same day. But to ruin those wretched children did not suffice. Furnished with authority by their father, the bishop, who never committed one crime without instantly conceiving another, had the children removed from the remote pension in which they were being brought up, and placed them under the roof of certain people in his hire, from the outset having resolved soon to make them serve his perfidious lust. He waited until they were 13, the little boy was the first to arrive at that age. The bishop put him to use, bent him to all his debauches, and as he was extremely pretty, sported with him for a week. But the little girl fared less well. She reached the prescribed age, but was very ugly, a fact which had no mitigating effect upon the good bishop's lubricious fury. His desires appeased, he feared lest these children, left alive, would someday discover something of the secret of their interests. Therefore, he conducted them to an estate belonging to his brother and, sure of recapturing, by means of a new crime, the sparks of lechery enjoyment had just caused him to lose, he immolated both of them to his ferocious passions, and accompanied their death with episodes so piquant and so cruel that his voluptuousness was reborn in the midst of the torments wherewith he beset them. The thing is, unhappily, only too well known. There is no libertine at least a little steeped in vice who is not aware of the great sway murder exerts over the senses, and how voluptuously it determines a discharge. And that is a general truth whereof it were well the reader be early advised, before undertaking the perusal of a work which will surely attempt an ample development of this system. Henceforth, at ease in the face of whatever might transpire, Monseigneur returned to Paris to enjoy the fruit of his misdeeds, and without the least qualms about having counteracted the intentions of a man who, in his present situation, was in no state to derive either pain or pleasure therefrom. The President de Courval was a pillar of society, almost 60 years of age, and worn by debauchery to a singular degree. He offered the eye not much more than a skeleton. He was tall, he was dry, thin, had 2 blue lusterless eyes, a livid and unwholesome mouth, a prominent chin, a long nose. Hairy as a satyr, flat-backed, with slack, drooping buttocks that rather resembled a pair of dirty rags flapping upon his upper thighs. The skin of those buttocks was, thanks to whip strokes, so deadened and toughened that you could seize up a handful and knead it without his feeling a thing. In the center of it all there was displayed no need to spread those cheeks, an immense orifice whose enormous diameter, odor, and color bore a closer resemblance to the depths of a well-freighted privy than to an asshole, and, crowning touch to these allurements, there was numbered among the sodomizing pig's little idiosyncrasies that of always leaving this particular part of himself in such a state of uncleanliness that one was at all times able to observe there a rim or pad a good 2 inches thick. Below a belly as wrinkled as it was livid and gummy, one perceived, within a forest of hairs, a tool which, in its erectile condition, might have been about 8 inches long and 7 around, but this condition had come to be the most rare, and to procure it a furious sequence of things was the necessary preliminary. Nevertheless, the event occurred at least 2 or 3 times each week, and upon these occasions the President would glide into every hole to be found, indiscriminately, although that of a young lad's behind was infinitely the most precious to him. The head of the President's device was now at all times exposed, for he had had himself circumcised, a ceremony which largely facilitates enjoyment and to which all pleasure-loving persons ought to submit. But one of the purposes of the same operation is to keep this privity cleaner. Nothing of the sort in Courval's case. This part of him was just as filthy as the other. This uncapped head, naturally quite thick to begin with, was thus made at least an inch ampler in circumference. Similarly untidy about all the rest of his person, the President, who furthermore had tastes at the very least as nasty as his appearance, had become a figure whose rather malodorous vicinity might not have succeeded in pleasing everyone. However, his colleagues were not at all of the sort to be scandalized by such trifles, and they simply avoided discussing the matter with him. Few mortals had been as free in their behavior or as debauches as the president, but, entirely jaded, absolutely besotted, all that remained to him was the depravation and lewd profligacy of libertinage. Above 3 hours of excess, and of the most outrageous excess, were needed before one could hope to inspire a voluptuous reaction in him. As for his emission, although in Kerval the phenomenon was far more frequent than erection, and could be observed once every day, it was, all the same, so difficult to obtain, or it never occurred save as an aftermath to things so strange and often so cruel or so unclean, that the agents of his pleasure not uncommonly renounced the struggle, fainting by the wayside, the which would give birth in him to a kind of lubricious anger, and this, through its effects, would now and again triumph where his efforts had failed. Kerval was to such a point mired down in the morass of vice and libertinage that it had become virtually impossible for him to think or speak of anything else. He unendingly had the most appalling expressions in his mouth, just as he had the vilest designs in his heart, and these with surpassing energy he mingled with blasphemies and imprecations supplied him by his true horror, a sentiment he shared with his companions, for everything that smacked of religion. This disorder of mind, yet further augmented by the almost continual intoxication in which he was fond of keeping himself, had during the 16 past few years given him an air of imbecility and prostration which, he would declare, made for his most cherished delight. Born as great a gourmand as a drunk, he alone was fit to keep abreast of the dew, and in the course of this tale we will behold him to perform wonders which will no doubt astonish the most veteran eaters. It had been 10 years since Kerval had ceased to discharge his judicial duties. It was not simply that he was no longer fit to carry them out, but I even believe that while he had been, he may have been asked to leave these matters alone for the rest of his life. Kerval had led a very libertine life, every sort of perversion was familiar to him, and those who knew him personally had the strong suspicion he owed his vast fortune to nothing other than 2 or 3 murders. However that may be, it is, in the light of the following story, highly probable that this variety of extravagance had the power to stir him deeply, and it is this adventure, which attracted some unfortunate publicity, that was responsible for his exclusion from the court. We are going to relate the episode in order to give the reader an idea of his character. There dwelled in the neighborhood of Kerval's townhouse a miserable street porter who, the father of a charming little girl, was ridiculous enough to be a person of sensibility. 20 messages of every kind had already arrived containing proposals relating to the poor fellow's daughter. He and his wife had remained unshaken despite this barrage aimed at their corruption, and Kerval, the source of these embassies, only irritated by the growing number of refusals they had evoked, knew not what tack to take in order to get his hands upon the girl and to subject her to his libidinous caprices, until it struck to him that by simply having the father broken he would lead the daughter to his bed. The thing was as nicely conceived as executed. 2 or 3 bullies in the president's pay intervened in the suit, and before the month was out, the wretched porter was enmeshed in an imaginary crime which seemed to have been committed at his door and which got him speedily lodged in one of the conciergeries dungeons. The president, as one would expect, soon took charge of the case, and, having no desire to permit it to drag on, arranged in the space of 3 days, thanks to his knavery and his gold, to have the unlucky porter condemned to be broken on the wheel, without the culprit ever having committed any crime but that of wishing to preserve his honor and safeguard his daughters. Meanwhile, the solicitations were renewed. The mother was brought in. It was explained to her that she alone had it in her power to save her husband, that if she were to satisfy the president, what could be clearer than that he would thereupon snatch her husband from the dreadful fate awaiting him. Further hesitation was impossible. The woman made inquiries. Kerval knew perfectly well to whom she addressed herself. The counsels were his creatures, and they gave her unambiguous replies. She ought not waste a moment. The poor woman herself brought her daughter weeping to her judge's feet. the latter could not have been more liberal with his promises, nor have been less eager to keep his word. Not only did he fear lest, were he to deal honorably and spare the husband, the man might go and raise an uproar upon discovering the price that had been paid to save his life, but the scoundrel even found a further delight, a yet keener one, in arranging to have himself given what he wished without being obliged to make any return. This thought led to others, numerous criminal possibilities entered his head, and their effect was to increase his perfidious lubricity. And this is how he set about the matter so as to put the maximum of infamy and piquancy into the scene. His mansion stood facing a spot where criminals are sometimes executed in Paris, and as this particular offense had been committed in that quarter of the city, he won assurance the punishment would be meted out on this particular square. The wretch's wife and daughter arrived at the president's home at the appointed hour. All windows overlooking the square were well shuttered, so that, from the apartments where he amused himself with his victims, nothing at all could be seen of what was going on outside. Apprised of the exact minute of the execution, the rascal selected it for the deflowering of the little girl who was held in her mother's arms, and everything was so happily arranged that Kerval discharged into the child's ass the moment her father expired. Instantly he'd completed his business. "Come have a look," quoth he, opening a window looking upon the square, "come see how well I've kept my bargain," and one of his two princesses saw her father, the other her husband, delivering up his soul to the headsman's steel. Both collapsed in a faint, but Kerval had provided for everything. This swoon was their agony, they'd both been poisoned, and never more opened their eyes. Notwithstanding the precautions he had taken to swathe the whole of this exploit in the most profound mystery, something did indeed transpire. Nothing was known of the women's death, but there existed a lively suspicion he had been untruthful in connection with the husband's case. His motive was half known, and his eventual retirement from the bench was the outcome. As of this moment, no longer having to maintain appearances, Kerval flung himself into a new ocean of errors and crimes. He sent everywhere for victims to sacrifice to the perversity of his tastes. Through an atrocious refinement of cruelty, but one, however, very easily understood, the downtrodden classes were those upon which he most enjoyed hurling the effects of his raging perfidy. He had several minions who were abroad night and day, scouring attics and hovels, tracking down whatever of the most destitute misery might be able to provide, and under the pretext of dispensing aid, either he envenomed his catch to give poison was one of his most delectable pastimes, or he lured it to his house and slew it upon the altar of his perverse preferences. Men, women, children, anything was fuel to his rage, and at its bidding he performed excesses which would have got his head between block and blade 1,000 times over were it not for the silver he distributed and the esteem he enjoyed, factors whereby he was 1,000 times protected. One may well imagine such a being had no more religion than his two confreres. He without doubt detested it as sovereignly as they, but in years past had done more to wither it in others, for, in the days when his mind had been sound, it had also been clever, and he had put it to good use writing against religion. He was the author of several works whose influence had been prodigious, and these successes, always present in his memory, still constituted one of his dearest delights. The more we multiply the objects of our enjoyments. A. The years of a sickly childhood. B. Durset is 53, he is small, short, broad, thick-set, an agreeable, hearty face, a very white skin, his entire body, and principally his hips and buttocks, absolutely like a woman's. His ass is cool and fresh, chubby, firm and dimpled, but excessively agape. Owing to the habit of sodomy, his prick is extraordinarily small, 'tis scarcely 2 inches around, no more than 4 inches long, it has entirely ceased to stiffen, his discharges are rare and uneasy, far from abundant and always preceded by spasms which hurl him into a kind of furor which, in turn, conducts him to crime. He has a chest like a woman's, a sweet, pleasant voice and, when in society, the best bred manners, although his mind is without question as depraved as his colleagues, a schoolmate of the Dew, they still sport together every day, and one of Dorset's loftiest pleasures is to have his anus tickled by the Dew's enormous member. And such, dear reader, are the four villains in whose company I am going to have you pass a few months. I have done my best to describe them, if, as I have wished, I have made you familiar with even their most secret depths, nothing in the tale of their various follies will astonish you. I have not been able to enter into minute detail with what regards their tastes. To have done so now would have been to impair the value and to harm the main scheme of this work. But as we move progressively along, you will have but to keep an attentive eye upon our heroes, and you'll have no trouble discerning their characteristic peccadillos and the particular type of voluptuous mania which best suits each of them. Roughly all we can say at the present time is that they were generally susceptible of an enthusiasm for sodomy, that the four of them had themselves buggered regularly, and that they all four worshipped behinds. The Dew, however, relative to the immensity of his weapon and, doubtless, more through cruelty than from taste, still fucked cunts with the greatest pleasure. So also did the president, but less frequently. As for the bishop, such was his supreme loathing for them the mere sight of one might have kept him limp for 6 months. He had never in all his life fucked but one, that belonging to his sister-in-law, and expressly to beget a child wherewith some day to procure himself the pleasures of incest. We have seen how well he succeeded. As regards Dorset, he certainly idolized the ass with as much fervor as the bishop, but his enjoyment of it was more accessory. His favorite attacks were directed toward a third sanctuary. This mystery will be unveiled in the sequel. But on with the portraits essential to the intelligence of this work, and let us now give our reader an idea of these worthy husbands for wives. What a contrast! Constance, the Dew's wife and the daughter of Dorset, was a tall woman, slender, lovely as a picture, and modelled as if the Graces had taken pleasure in embellishing her, but the elegance of her figure in no way detracted from her freshness. She was not for that the less plumply fleshed, and the most delicious. Forms graced by a skin fairer than the lily, often induced one to suppose that, no, it had been love itself who had undertaken her formation. Her face was a trifle long, her features wonderfully noble, more majesty than gentleness was in her look, more grandeur than subtlety. Her eyes were large, black, and full of fire, her mouth extremely small and ornamented by the finest teeth imaginable. She had a narrow, supple tongue, of the loveliest pink, and her breath was sweeter still than the scent of a rose. She was full-breasted, her bosom was buxom, fair as alabaster and as firm. Her back was turned in an extraordinary way, its lines sweeping deliciously down to the most artistically and the most precisely cleft ass nature has produced in a long time. Nothing could have been more perfectly round, not very large, but firm, white, dimpled, and when it was opened, what used to peep out but the cleanest, most winsome, most delicate hole. A nuance of tenderest pink had shaded this ass, charming asylum of lubricity's sweetest pleasures, but, great God! It was not for long to preserve so many charms. 4 or 5 attacks, and the Dew had spoiled all those graces. How quickly had they gone, and soon after her marriage Constance was become no more than the image of a beautiful lily wherefrom the tempest has of late stripped the petals away. 2 round and perfectly molded thighs supported another temple, in all likelihood less delicious, but, to incline to worship there, offering so many allurements it would be in vain were my pen to strive to describe them. Constance was almost a virgin when the Dew married her, and her father, the only man who had known her, had, as they say, left that side of her perfectly intact. The most beautiful black hair falling in natural curls to below her shoulders and, when one wished it thus, reaching down to the pretty fur, of the same color, which shaded that voluptuous little cunt. Made for a further adornment I might have been guilty of omitting, and lent this angelic creature, aged about 22, all the charms nature is able to lavish upon a woman. To all these amenities Constance joined a fair and agreeable wit, a spirit somewhat more elevated than it ought to have been, considering the melancholy situation fate had awarded her, for thereby she was enabled to sense all its horrors and, doubtless, she would have been happier if furnished with less delicate perceptions. Dorset, who had raised her more as if she were a courtesan than his daughter, and who had been much more concerned to give her talents than manners, had all the same never been able totally to destroy the principles of rectitude and of virtue it seemed nature had been pleased to engrave in her heart. She had no formal religion, no one had ever mentioned such a thing to her, the exercise of a belief was not to be tolerated in her father's household, but all that had not blotted out this modesty, this natural humility which has nothing to do with theological chimeras, and which, when it dwells in an upright, decent, and sensitive soul, is very difficult to obliterate. Never had she stepped out of her father's house, and the scoundrel had forced her, beginning at the age of 12, to serve his crapulous pleasures. She found a world of difference in those the dew imbibed with her, her body was noticeably altered by those formidable dimensions, and the day after the dew had despoiled her of her maidenhead, sodomistically speaking, she had fallen dangerously ill. They believed her rectum had been irreparably damaged, but her youth, her health, and some salutary local remedies soon restored the use of that forbidden avenue to the dew, and the luckless Constance, forced to accustom herself to this daily torture, and it was but one amongst others, entirely recovered and became adjusted to everything. Beauty which was perhaps superior to Constance's, but of an entirely different sort. She was 20, small and slender, of an extremely slight and delicate build, of classic loveliness, had the finest blonde hair to be seen. An interesting air, a look of sensibility distributed everywhere about her, and above all in her features, gave her the quality of a heroine in a romance. Her exceptionally large eyes were blue, they expressed at once tenderness and decency, two long but narrow and remarkably drawn eyebrows adorned a forehead not very high but of such noble charm one might have thought this were modesty's very temple. Her nose, thin, a little pinched at the top, descended to assume a semi-aquiline contour, her lips inclined toward the thin, were of a bright, ripe red, a little large, her mouth was the unique flaw in this celestial physiognomy, but when it opened, there shone 32 pearls nature seemed to have sown amidst roses. Her neck was a shade long, attached in a singular way, through what one judged a natural habit, her head was ever so faintly bent toward her right shoulder, especially when she was listening, but with what grace did not this interesting attitude endow her. Her breasts were small, very round, very firm, well elevated, but there was barely enough there to fill the hand. They were like two little apples a frolicking Cupid had fetched hither from his mother's garden. Her chest was a bit narrow, it was also a very delicate chest, her belly was satin smooth, a little blonde mound not much garnished with hair served as peristyle to the temple in which Venus seemed to call out for an homage. This temple was narrow to such a point you could not insert a finger therein without eliciting a cry from Adelaide. Nevertheless, 2 lustrums had revolved since the time when, thanks to the President, the poor child had ceased to be a virgin, either in that place or in the delicious part it remains for us to sketch. Oh, what were the attractions this second sanctuary possessed, what a flow in the line of her back, how magnificently were those buttocks cut, what whiteness there, and what dazzling rose blush. But all on all, it was on the small side. Delicate in all her lines, she was rather the sketch than the model of beauty, it seemed as though nature had only wished to indicate in Adelaide what she had so majestically articulated in Constance. Peer into that appetizing behind, and lo! A rosebud would offer itself to your gaze, and it was in all its bloom and in the most tender pink nature wished you to behold it, but narrow, tiny. It had only been at the price of infinite labors the President had navigated through those straits, and he had only renewed these assaults successfully 2 or 3 times. Dorset, less exacting, gave her little affliction in this point, but, since becoming his wife, in exchange for how many other cruel complaisances, with what a quantity of other perilous submissions had she not been obliged to purchase this little kindness. And, furthermore, turned over to the 4 libertines, as by their mutual consent she was, how many other cruel ordeals had she not to undergo, both of the species Dorset spared her, and of every other. Adelaide had the mind her face suggested, that is to say, an extremely romantic mind. Solitary places were the ones she preferred, and once there, she would shed involuntary tears to which we do not pay sufficient heed, tears apparently torn from nature by foreboding. She was recently bereft of a friend, a girl she idolized, and this frightful loss constantly haunted her imagination. As she was thoroughly acquainted with her father, as she knew to what extents he carried his wild behavior, she was persuaded her young friend had fallen prey to the president's villainies, for he had never managed to induce the missing person to accord him certain privileges. The thing was not unlikely. Adelaide imagined the same would someday befall her, nor was that improbable. The president, in her regard, had not paid the same attention to the problem of religion Dorset had in the interests of Constance. No, he had allowed all that nonsense to be borne, to be fomented, supposing that his writings and his discourses would easily destroy it. He was mistaken. Religion is the nourishment upon which a soul such as Adelaide's feeds. In vain the president had preached, in vain he had made her read books, the young lady had remained a believer, and all these extravagances, which she did not share, which she hated, of which she was the victim, fell far short of disabusing her about illusions which continued to make for her life's happiness. She would go and hide herself to pray to God, she'd perform Christian duties on the sly, and was unfailingly and very severely punished, either by her father or her husband, when surprised in the act by the one or the other. Adelaide patiently endured it all, fully convinced heaven would someday reward her. Her character was as gentle as her spirit, and her benevolence, one of the virtues for which her father most detested her, went to the point of extreme. Kerval, whom that vile class of the poverty-stricken irritated, sought only to humiliate it, to further depress it, or to wring victims from it. His generous daughter, on the other hand, would have foregone her own necessities to procure them for the poor, and she had often been espied stealing off to take to the needy sums which were intended for her pleasures. Dorset and the president finally succeeded in scolding and pounding good manners into her, and in ridding her of this corrupt practice by withholding absolutely all means whereby she could resume it. Adelaide, having nothing left but her tears to bestow upon the poor, went none the less to sprinkle them upon their woes, and her powerless howbeit staunchly sensitive spirit was incapable of ceasing to be virtuous. One day she learned that some poor woman was to come to prostitute her daughter to the president because extreme need bade her do so. The enchanted old rake was already preparing himself for the kind of pleasure-taking he liked best. Adelaide had one of her dresses sold and immediately got the money, put it in the mother's hands. By means of this small assistance and some sort of a sermon, she diverted the woman from the she was about to commit. Hearing of what she had done, the president proceeded to such violences with her. His daughter was not yet married at the time that she was a fortnight abed, but all that was to no avail. Nothing could put a stop to this gentle soul's tender impulses. Julie, the president's wife, the Dew's elder daughter, would have eclipsed the 2 preceding women were it not for something which many behold as a capital defect, but which had perhaps in itself aroused Kerval's passion for her. So true it is that the effects of passion are unpredictable, nay, inconceivable, and that their disorder, the outcome of disgust and satiety, can only be matched by their irregular flights. Julie was tall, well made although quite fat and fleshy, had the most lovely brown eyes in the world, a charming nose, striking and gracious features, the most beautiful chestnut brown hair, a fair body of the most appetizing fullness, an ass which might easily have served as model to the one Praxiteles sculpted. Her cunt was hot, straight, and yielded as agreeable a sensation as such a locale ever may. Her legs were handsome, Her feet charming, but she had the worst decked mouth, the foulest teeth, and was by habit so dirty in every other part of her body, and principally at the two temples of lubricity, that no other being, let me repeat it, no other being but the President, himself subject to the same shortcomings and unquestionably fond of them, nay, no one else, despite her allurements, could have put up with Julie. Kerval, however, was mad about her, his most divine pleasures were gathered upon that stinking mouth, to kiss it plunged him into delirium, and as for her natural uncleanliness, far from rebuking her for it, to the contrary he encouraged her in it, and had finally got her accustomed to a perfect divorce from water. To these faults Julie added a few others, but they were surely less disagreeable. She was a vast eater, she had a leaning toward drunkenness, little virtue, and I believe that had she dared try it, whoredom would have held little by way of terror for her. Brought up by the Dew in a total abandon of principles and manners, she adopted a whore's philosophy, and she was probably an apt student of all its tenets. But, through yet another very curious effect of libertinage, it often happens that a woman who shares our faults pleases us a great deal less in our pleasures than one who is full of naught but virtues. The first resembles us, we scandalize her not, the other is terrified, and there is one very certain charm more. Despite his proportions, the Dew had sported with his daughter, but he had had to wait until she was 15, and even so had not been able to prevent Julie from being considerably damaged by the adventure, indeed, so much so that, eager to marry her off, he had been forced to put a term to pleasure-taking of this variety and to be content with delights less dangerous for her, but at least as fatiguing. Julie gained little by gaining the President, whose prick, as we know, was exceedingly thick and, furthermore, however much she was dirty from neglect of herself, she could not in any wise keep up with a filthiness in debauch such as the one that distinguished the President, her beloved spouse. Aline, Julie's younger sister and really the daughter of the bishop, possessed habits and defects and a character very unlike her sister's. She was the most youthful of the four, she had just become 18, she had a fetching, exuberantly healthy and almost pert little countenance, a little turned-up nose, brown eyes full of expression and vivacity, a delicious mouth, a most shapely though somewhat tall figure, well-fleshed, the skin a bit dark but soft and fine, as rather on the ample side but well molded, a pair of the most voluptuous buttocks that ever a libertine eye may behold, the love-mound brown-haired and pretty, the cunt a trifle low or, as they say, à l'anglaise, but as tight as one might wish, and when she was presented to the assembly she was thoroughly a maid. And she still was at the time the party we are to chronicle got under way, and we shall see in what manner her maidenhead was annihilated. As for the first fruits of her ass, the bishop had been peacefully plucking them every day for the past 8 years, but without, however, arousing in his dear daughter much of a taste for these exercises. She, despite her mischievous and randy air, only cooperated out of obedience and had never hinted that she shared the slightest pleasure in the infamies whose daily victim she was. The bishop had left her in the most profound ignorance, scarcely did she know how to read or write, and she had absolutely no idea of religion's existence. Her mind was natural, it was that of a child, she would give droll replies, she liked to play, she loved her sister a great deal, detested the bishop out of all measure, and feared the Dew as she dreaded fire. On the wedding day, when she discovered herself naked and surrounded by the 4 men, she wept, and moreover did all that was asked of her, acting without pleasure as without ill temper. She was sober, very clean, and having no other fault but that of laziness, nonchalance reigned in all her movements and doings and everywhere about her person, despite the liveliness announced by her bright eyes. She abhorred the President almost as much as she hated her uncle, and Dorset, who treated her with no excess of consideration, nevertheless seemed to be the only one for whom she appeared to have no repugnance. These were the 8 principal characters in whose company we are going to enable you to live, good reader. It is now time to divulge the object of singular pleasures that were proposed. It is commonly accepted amongst authentic libertines that the sensations communicated by the organs of hearing are the most flattering and those impressions are the liveliest. As a consequence, our four villains, who were of a mind to have voluptuousness implant itself in the very core of their beings as deeply and as overwhelmingly as ever it could penetrate, had, to this end, devised something quite clever indeed. It was this: after having immured themselves within everything that was best able to satisfy the senses through lust, after having established this situation, the plan was to have described to them, in the greatest detail and in due order, every one of debauchery's extravagances, all its divagations, all its ramifications, all its contingencies, all of what is termed in libertine language its passions. There is simply no conceiving the degree to which man varies them when his imagination grows inflamed. Excessive may be the differences between men that is created by all their other manias, by all their other tastes, but in this case it is even more so, and he who should succeed in isolating and categorizing and detailing these follies would perhaps perform one of the most splendid labors which might be undertaken in the study of manners, and perhaps one of the most interesting. It would thus be a question of finding some individuals capable of providing an account of all these excesses, then of analyzing them, of extending them, of itemizing them, of graduating them, and of running a story through it all, to provide coherence and amusement. Such was the decision adopted. After innumerable inquiries and investigations, they located 4 women who had attained their prime. That was necessary. Experience was the fundamental thing here. 4 women, I say, who, having spent their lives in the most furious debauchery, had reached the state where they could provide an exact account of all these matters, and as care had been taken to select 4 endowed with a certain eloquence and a fitting turn of mind, after much discussion, recording, and arranging, all 4 were ready to insert, each into the adventures of her life, all the most extraordinary vagaries of debauch, and to do so in such an order and at such a pace that the first, for example, would work into the tale of her life's activities the 150 simple passions and the least esoteric or most ordinary deviations; the second, within the same framework, an equal number of more unusual passions involving one or more men with one or several women; the third was also to introduce into her narration 150 of the most criminal whimsies and those which most outrage the laws of both nature and religion, and as all these excesses lead to murder, and as these murders committed through libertinage are infinitely various and are just as numerous as the occasions upon which the libertine's inflamed imagination adopts different tortures, the fourth was to adorn the events of her life with a meticulous report upon 150 assorted examples of them. In the meantime, our libertines, surrounded, as at the outset I indicated, by their wives and also by other objects in every kind, were to pay close heed, were to be mentally heated, and were to end by extinguishing, by means of either their wives or those various objects, the conflagration the storytellers were to have lit. There is surely nothing more voluptuous in this project than the luxurious manner whereby it was carried out, and they are both this manner and these several recitations which are to compose this work, wherewith, having said this much, I advise the overmodest to lay my book aside at once if he would not be scandalized, for 'tis already clear there's not much of the chaste in our plan, and we dare hold ourselves answerable in advance that there'll be still less in its execution. Insomuch as the 4 actresses we have been speaking of play a most essential role in these memoirs, we believe, even were we to have to beg the reader's forgiveness therefore, we should still feel obliged to describe them. They will narrate, they will act. Such being the case, is it possible that they remain unknown? Banish all expectation of beauties portrayed, although there were doubtless in the plan's provisions for employing these 4 creatures physically as well as morally. Be that as it may, neither their charms nor their years were the deciding factors, but rather their minds and their experience only that counted, and with what regards the latter, our friends could not possibly have made better choices. Madame Duclos was she to whom they entrusted the relating of the 150 simple passions. The woman who went by this name was 48 years of age, still in fairly good condition and preserving the vestiges of beauty. She had very handsome eyes, an exceedingly fair skin, and one of the most splendid and plumpest asses that could ever favor your gaze, a mouth both clean and fresh, superb breasts, and pretty brown hair, a heavy figure but a noble one, and all the looks and tone of a brilliant whore. She had spent her life, as shall be observed, in places and under circumstances where indeed she had been obliged to study what she is going to relate, and to see her was to realize she must have gone to the task with wit and verve, with ease and interest. Madame Champville was a tall woman about 50, slender, well-made, having the most voluptuous quality in her look and bearing, a faithful devotee of Sappho. She had that kind of expression even in her slightest movements, in her simplest gestures, in her least words. She had ruined herself for the sake of keeping girls and, had it not been for this predilection to which she generally sacrificed everything she was able to earn abroad, she might have been comfortably well-to-do. For a long time she had been in public service, and during recent years had been making her way as an outfitter in her turn, but had confined herself to a limited practice, her clients being reliable rake-hells of a certain age. Never did she receive young men, and this prudent conduct was lucrative and did something to improve her affairs. She had been blonde, but a more venerable tint, and that of wisdom, was beginning to color her hair. Her eyes were still exceedingly attractive, blue, and they contained a most agreeable expressiveness. Her mouth was lovely, still fresh, missing no teeth as yet. She was flat-chested but had a belly which was good, but had never aroused envy. Her mound was rather prominent, and her clitoris protruded 3 inches when well warmed. Tickle this part of her and one was certain to see her fly into an ecstasy in no time, and especially if the service was rendered by a female. Her ass was very flabby and worn from use, entirely soft, wrinkled, withered, and so toughened by the libidinous customs she in recounting her history will explain to us, that one could do everything one wished without her feeling anything there. One strange and assuredly very rare thing, above all. In Paris, she was as much a maid on this side as a girl emerging from a convent, and perhaps, had it not been for the accursed part she put to use with people who cared for nothing but the extraordinary and whom, consequently, that side pleased, perhaps, I say, had it not been for that part, this singular virginity might have perished with her. Madame Martin, a portly matron of 52, very well preserved and very healthy and blessed with the biggest and most beautiful rump one could wish for, boasted the precise opposite by way of adventure. She had devoted her life to sodomitical debauch, and was so well familiarized therewith she tasted absolutely no joy save therefrom. A natural deformity, she had also been blessed with an obstruction, having prevented her from knowing any other. She had given herself over to this kind of pleasure, led to it both by her inability to do anything else and by early habit, in consideration of which she clung fast to this lubricity wherein 'twas declared she was yet delicious, ready to brave come what might, dreading nothing. The most monstrous engines were as naught to her, in fact such were the ones she preferred, and the sequel to these papers will perhaps reveal her still giving valorous fight beneath the standards of Sodom, as the most intrepid of bugresses. Her features were gracious enough, but signs of languor and of decline were beginning to mar her attractions, and but for the plumpness sustaining her yet, she might have been thought time-worn and frayed. As for Madame Desgranges, she was vice and lust personified, tall, thin, 56, ghostly pale and emaciated, dead dull eyes, dead lips. She offered an image of crime about to perish for lack of strength. She had once upon a time been brunette. There were some who even maintained she'd had a beautiful body. Not long thereafter it had become a mere skeleton capable of inspiring nothing but disgust. Her ass, withered, worn, marked, torn, more resembled marbled paper than human skin, and its hole was so gaping, sprung, and rugose that the bulkiest machines could, without her knowing a thing, penetrate it dry. By way of crowning graces, this generous Cytherean athlete, wounded in several combats, was missing one nipple and 3 fingers. She limped, and was without 6 teeth and an eye. We may perhaps learn by what order of attacks she had been so mistreated, but one thing is certain, nothing she had suffered had induced her to mend her ways, and if her body was the picture of ugliness, her was the depository of all the most unheard of vices and crimes, an arsonist, a parricide, a sodomite, atribute, a murderess, a poisoner, guilty of incest, of rape, of theft, of abortions, and of sacrileges. One might truthfully affirm that there is not a single crime in the world this villain had not committed herself, or had others commit for her. Her present calling was procuring. She was one of society's most heavily titled furnishers, and as to much experience she joined a more or less agreeable prattle. She had been chosen to fill the role of 4th storyteller, that is to say, the one in whose story the greatest number of infamies and horrors were to be combined. Who better than a creature who had performed them all could have played this part? These women once found, and found in every article to be such as was desired, the friends turned their attentions to accessories. They had from the outset planned to surround themselves with a large number of lust-inspiring objects of either sex, but when it was brought to their attention that the only setting in which this lubricious roister could conveniently be held was that same chateau in Switzerland belonging to Durset, the one in which he had dispatched little Elvire, when, I say, it was remarked that this chateau of only moderate size would not be able to lodge so great a throng of inhabitants, and that, what was more, it might well prove unwise or dangerous to bring along such a host, the list of subjects was trimmed to 32 in all, the storytellers included, to wit, 4 of that class, 8 young girls, 8 young boys, 8 men endowed with monstrous members, for the delights of passive sodomy, and 4 female servants. But thoroughness went into the recruiting of all that. A year was devoted to these details, an enormous amount of money too, and these are the measures they employed to obtain the most delicious specimens of all France could offer in the way of 8 little girls, 16 intelligent procuresses, each accompanied by 2 lieutenants, were sent into the 16 major provinces of France, while a 17th was occupied with the same work in Paris only. Each of these outfitters was given a rendezvous at one of the Deux estates on the outskirts of Paris, and all of them were to appear there, during the same week, exactly 10 months after the date of their departure. This was the period they were given for searching. Each was to bring back 9 subjects, which came to a total of 153 girls, from which 153 a choice of only 8 was to be made. The procuresses were instructed to emphasize high birth, virtuousness, and the most delicious visage possible. They were to conduct their researches so as to draw material chiefly from eminent families, and were not to hand over any girl without being able to prove that she had been forcibly abducted from either a convent housing pensioners of quality, or from the home of a family, and that a family of distinction. Whatever was not superior to the class of bourgeoisie, and what from these upper classes was not both very virtuous and wholly virgin and impeccably beautiful, would be refused without mercy. Spies were posted to survey these women's proceedings and to supply the society with exhaustive and prompt reports of what they were doing. For each suitable subject found, they were paid 30,000 francs, the agents assuming all expenses. The costs were incredible. With respect to age, it was fixed at from 12 to 15, anything above or between was pitilessly rejected. At the same time, under identical circumstances, with the same means, at the same expense, 17 ages of sodomy likewise scoured the capital and the provinces in search of little boys, and their rendezvous was set for a month after the selection of the girls. As for the young men whom we propose henceforth to designate as fuckers, the size of the member was the sole criterion. Nothing under 10 or 11 inches long by 7 or 8 around was acceptable. 8 men labored throughout the kingdom to supply this demand, and their rendezvous was scheduled to fall a month after the little boys. While the story of how these selections were made and received is not our foremost concern, it might not be inappropriate at this point to insert a word on the subject in order to bring out yet a little more of our 4 heroes' genius. It seems to me that nothing which serves to enlarge the reader's understanding of these figures and to shed light upon a party as extraordinary as the one we are going to describe, can be judged irrelevant. The time for the assembling of the little girls having arrived, everyone converged upon the Deux's estate. Some few procuresses having been unable to fill their quota of 9, some others having lost their charges en route, either by illness or flight, only 130 of them were present at the rendezvous, but what charms! Great God! Never, I believe, have so many charms been seen gathered together in one place. 13 days were given over to this examination, and each day 10 of them were inspected. The 4 friends gathered in a circle, and in its middle was placed the little girl, dressed as she had been seized. The procuress responsible for her capture recited her history. If something of the conditions of high birth or virtue were wanting, the inquiry went no deeper. The child was forthwith rejected, without appeal, and sent on her way, and the purveyor lost all that she had spent in connection with her. Next, having provided all the vital particulars, the procuress was asked to retire, and the child was interrogated in order to determine whether what had just been alleged were true. If all seemed well, the procuress was called in again, and she lifted the girl's skirts from behind, so as to expose her buttocks to the group. This was the first thing it wished to examine. The slightest defect in this part was grounds for immediate rejection. If on the contrary naught were amiss here, she was ordered to strip, or was stripped, and, naked, she passed and passed again, 5 or 6 times over, from one of our libertines to the other. She was turned about, she was turned the other way, she was fingered, she was handled, they sniffed, they spread, they peeped, they examined the state of the goods. Was it new, was it used, but did all this coolly and without permitting the senses illusion to upset any aspect of the examination. This done, the child was led away, and beside her name inscribed upon a ballot, the examiners wrote passed or failed and signed their names. These ballots were then dropped into a box, the voters refraining from communicating their opinions to one another. All the girls examined, the box was opened. In order to be accepted, a girl had to have our 4 friends' names in her favor. The absence of one name was enough to exclude her instantly and, in every instance, inexorably, as I have said, the unsuitable ones were kicked directly out, set at large, alone and without a guide, save when, as happened with perhaps a dozen, our libertines frolicked with them after the choices had been made and before turning them over to their procuresses. This round resulted in the exclusion of 50 candidates. The other 80 were gone over afresh, but with much greater exactitude and severity. The least defect warranted instantaneous dismissal. 1, lovely as the day, was weeded out because one of her teeth grew a shade higher from the gum than the rest. More than 20 others were refused because they were daughters of nothing better than bourgeois. 30 were eliminated during this second round, hence only 50 were left. The friends resolved not to continue to the third round until having first being relieved of some fuck through these 50 aspirants' own ministry, this in order that the senses' perfect calm could ensure saner and sounder choice. Each of the quartet encompassed himself by a team of 12 or 13 children. Members of each team adopted varying attitudes, teams were shifted, everything was brought off with such dexterity, there was, in a word, so much lubricity in the doing that sperm flow, temperatures subsided, and another 30 disappeared from the race. 20 remained, that was still a dozen too many. Further expedients to procure calm were resorted to, every means wherefrom one would suppose disgust could be borne was employed, but the 20 still remained, and how might one have subtracted from a number of creatures so wonderfully celestial you would have declared they were the very work of a divinity? Equal in beauty, Something else had to discovered which could at least award 8 of them some kind of superiority over the 12 others, and what the president then proposed was worthy indeed of all the disorder of his mind. That made no difference, the suggestion was accepted. It had to do with finding out which of them would best do something the chosen 8 would be often called upon to do. 4 days sufficed amply to decide this question, and at last 12 were given their leave, but not blankly as in the case of the others. They provided a week's complete and exhaustive amusement, then were put into the keeping of the procuresses, who soon made a pretty penny from the prostitution of creatures as distinguished as these. As for the successful 8, they were installed in a convent to keep until the day of departure, and in order to reserve until the designated period the pleasure of enjoying them, the 4 colleagues did not touch them before then. I'll not be so foolhardy as to attempt to describe these beauties. They were all of them superior in an equal degree. My brush strokes would necessarily be monotonous. I shall be content to give their names and to affirm that upon my word it is perfectly impossible to obtain an idea of such an assemblage of graces, of attractions, of perfections, and that had nature wished to give man an idea of what her greatest and wisest art can create, she would not have presented him with other models. The first was named Augustine. She was 15, the daughter of a Languedoc baron, and had been kidnapped from a convent in Montpellier. The second was named Fanny. She was the daughter of a councillor to the Parliament of Brittany and had been abducted from her father's own chateau. The third was named Zelmire. She was 15 years old. She was the Comte de Tervilly's daughter, and he idolized her. He had taken her hunting with him on one of his estates in Beaussy, and, having left her alone in the forest for a moment, she had been pounced upon at once. She was only a child and, with a dowry of 400,000 francs, was the following year to have married a very great lord. It was she who most wept and grieved at the horror of her fate. The fourth was named Sophie. She was 14 and was the daughter of a rather well-to-do gentleman who lived on his estate in Berry. She had been seized while on a walk with her mother, who, seeking to defend her, was flung into a river, where she expired before her daughter's eyes. The fifth was named Colombe. She was from Paris, the child of a councillor to Parliament. She was 13 and had been kidnapped while returning in the evening to her convent with a governess, after leaving a children's ball. The governess had been stabbed to death. The sixth was named Hebe. She was just 12, the daughter of a cavalry captain, a nobleman who lived in Orleans. The youngster had been enticed and carried away from the convent where she was being brought up. 2 nuns had been bought. You could not hope to find anything more seductive or sweeter. The seventh was named Rosette. She was 13 and was the child of the Lieutenant General of Chalon-sur-Saône. Her father had just died. She was with her mother in the countryside near the city, and was captured within sight of her relatives by agents disguised as thieves. The last was named Mimi or Michette. She was 12. She was the daughter of the Marquis de Sade and had been kidnapped on her father's estate in the Bourbonnais while on a carriage drive which she had been allowed to take with 2 or 3 women from the chateau. The women were murdered. It will be remarked that the preparations for these revels cost much money and many crimes. To such people, treasure means exceedingly little, and as for crime, one was then living in an age when it was not by any means probed and punished the way it is nowadays. Hence everything succeeded, and so prettily that, the inquests amounting to virtually nothing at all, our libertines were never troubled by consequences. The time drew nigh for the examination of the little boys. Easier to obtain, their number was greater. The pimps produced 150 of them, and it will surely be no exaggeration if I affirm that they at least equaled the little girls, as much in their innocence, and their elevated rank. 30,000 francs were paid for each of them, the same sum given for the girls, but the entrepreneurs risked nothing, because this game being more delicate and far more to the taste of our epicures, it had been decided that no one would be put in danger of losing his expenses, that while the lads with whom it was impossible to come to terms would be rejected, as they would be put to some use they would also be paid for. Their examination was conducted like that of the girls, 10 were verified each day, but with the very wise precaution which had been a little too much neglected with the girls, with the precaution, I say, of always preceding the examination by a discharge arranged with the aid of the 10 who were under present scrutiny. The others were half of a mind to bar the president from the ceremony. They were wary of the deprivation of his tastes. They had feared, in the selection of the girls, being made the dupes of his accursed predilection for infamy and degradation. He promised to keep himself in check, and if he kept his word, it is unlikely he did so without difficulty, for when once a damaged or diseased imagination becomes accustomed to these species of outrages against good taste and nature, outrages which so deliciously flatter it, it is no easy matter to restore such a person to the path of righteousness. It seems as if the desire to satisfy his longing displaces reason in his judgments. Scorning what is truly beautiful, no longer cherishing but what is frightful, desire's pronouncements correspond to its criteria, and the return to truer sentiments would appear to him to be a wrong done those principles whence he should be most sorry to stray. 100 hopefuls were found unanimously approved when the initial séances were over, and these decisions had to be 5 times reconsidered in order to arrive at the small group alone to be accepted. Thrice in succession 50 survived the balloting, and then, to reduce that number to the stipulated 8, the jurors were compelled to resort to unusual measures in order somehow to lessen the appeal of idols still glamorous despite everything they had been able to do to them. The idea occurred to them to dress the boys as girls. 25 were eliminated by this trick which, lending to a sex they worshipped the garb of one to which they had become indifferent, depreciated their value and ruined almost all the illusion. But nothing could alter the voting on the 25 that were left. 'Twas all in vain they spattered their fuck about, in vain they wrote their names upon the ballots at the same moment they discharged, in vain they put to use the expedient adopted with the little girls. The 25 proved irreducible every time, and at last they agreed to have them draw lots. Here are the names they gave the lucky ones who remained, their age, their birth, and a word or two about their adventures, their portraits. I cry off, Cupid's own features were surely no more delicate, and the models Albany sought from which to choose traits for his divine angels must certainly have been inferior by far. Zelamir was 13 years old. He was the only son of a gentleman out of Poitou who had been bringing him up with the greatest care. Escorted by a single domestic, he had been sent to Poitiers to visit a kinsman. Our rogues ambushed them, slew the domestic, and made off with the child. Cupidon was the same age. He had been a pupil in a school at La Flèche, and was the son of a gentleman dwelling in the vicinity of that town. A trap was laid for the boy. He was kidnapped while on an outing the students used to take on Sundays. He was the prettiest pupil in the entire college. Naxos was 12, he was a knight of Malta. He had been abducted in Rouen, where his father filled an honorable post compatible with his nobility. The boy was en route to the Collège de Louis Le Grand at Paris. He was waylaid and seized while on the road. Zephyr, the most delicious of the 8, it being supposed that their excessive beauty might allow the possibility of a choice, was from Paris. He was pursuing his studies there, in a famous pension. His father, a ranking officer, did all in his power to get his son back, and failed. Money had seduced the headmaster of the school, who delivered 7 specimens, of whom 6 were refused. Zephyr had set the Jew's head to spinning, and the latter protested that were it to have cost $1 million to bugger the boy he would have paid it in cash on the spot. He reserved to himself the lad's initiation, and it was generally granted him. O tender and delicate child, what disproportion and what a dreadful fate were in store for you. Celadon was the son of a magistrate of Nancy. He was captured at Luneville, whither he had gone to visit his aunt. He had just attained his 14th year. In this case a girl was used to bait the trap. Celadon and she were introduced. The little wench drew him into the snare by feigning love for him. He was negligently chaperoned. The stroke was successful. Adonis was 15. He was ravished at Plessis, where he was enrolled in school. He was the son of a judge of the assize courts who raised a great hue and cry, but all to no avail. The capture had been so nicely planned no one knew a thing about it. Kerval, who had been mad about the child for 2 years, had made his acquaintance at his father's house, and it was he who had supplied the means and information necessary to debauch him. The others were greatly surprised to find such sensible good taste in a head so depraved as Kerval's, and he, most proud, profited from the event to show his colleagues that, as was plainly to be seen, he still could boast a sometimes fine palate. The child recognized him and fell to weeping, but the president consoled him with the assurance it would be to him would befall the deflowering, and while uttering these comforting words, he wobbled his enormous engine against those frail little buttocks. Kerval asked the assembly for the boy. His request was unopposed. Hyacinth was 14 years old. He was the son of a retired officer living in a small city in Champagne. He adored hunting and was taken while afield, his father having been so imprudent as to allow him to set out alone. Guiton was 12, he was kidnapped at Versailles from amidst of the page boys at the king's stables. He was the son of a man of consequence from the Nivernais, who not 6 months prior had brought him to Versailles. He was very simply abducted while walking alone on the Avenue de Saint Cloud. He became the bishop's passion, and to the bishop was the prize decreed. Thus, were the masculine deities our libertines prepared for their lubricity, we will see in due time and place the use to which they were put. 142 subjects remained, but whereas there had been much trifling over the 8, there was none with this game. Not one of the defeated candidates was dismissed until he had served some purpose. Our libertines spent a month with them at the Douze Chateau. As they were on the eve of setting forth, as all the practical arrangements were completed, the company had little else to do but amuse itself until the day of departure. When at last they were thoroughly fed up with their sport, they fell upon a pleasant means for disposing of what had provided it, that was to sell the boys to a Turkish pirate, a scheme whereby no trace of them would be left and a part of the costs would be recovered. They were sent in small groups to a place near Monaco. The Turk came to get them and lead them off into slavery, doubtless a dreadful fate, but one whereby, none the less, our 4 villains were hugely entertained. And now came the moment of choosing the fuckers. Those of this class who failed to meet the standards were the cause of no embarrassment. Being mature and reasonable men, it was enough to pay them for their trouble, their traveling expenses, and send them home. The 8 experts who had contracted to furnish the fuckers had, furthermore, many fewer obstacles to surmount, since the specifications were by and large concrete and the conditions made no difference at all. Thus it was 50 came to the rendezvous. From amongst the 20 biggest, the 8 youngest and most attractive were singled out, and since in the sequel mention will almost never be made save of the 4 biggest of the 8, I shall restrict myself to naming these. Hercule, with a body hewn in the image of the god whose name he had been given, was 26 years of age and was endowed with a member 8 1/4 inches around by 13 long. Nothing more beautiful nor more majestic has ever been seen. This tool was almost always upright, and with only 8 discharges, so tests revealed, it could fill a pint measure to the brim. Hercule was also very gentle, very sweet, and had an interesting countenance. Antinoios, so named because, like Hadrian's favorite, he had, together with the world's prettiest prick, its most voluptuous ass, and that exceedingly rare. Antinoios wielded a device measuring 8 inches in circumference and 12 in length. He was 30 and had a face worthy of his other features. Bumcleaver lugged a club so amusingly shaped it was nearly impossible for him to perform an embuggery without splitting the ass, whence came the name he bore. The head of his prick resembled the heart of an ox. It was 8 3/8 inches around. Behind it, the shaft measured only 8, but was crooked and had such a curve it neatly tore the anus when penetrating it, and this quality, very precious to libertines as jaded as ours, had made him singularly sought after. In Vitus, so named because, no matter what he did, his erection was perpetual, was furnished with an engine 11 inches long and 7 and 15/16 inches around. Greater ones, who had difficulty stiffening, had been turned away to make room for him who, regardless of the quantity of discharges he produced in a day, rose heavenward at the slightest touch. The other 4 were of about the same dimensions and the same shape. The 42 rejected candidates provided a fortnight's entertainment and, after the friends had put them through their paces and worn them to the bone, they were well rewarded and bidden adieu. Nothing now remained but the choice of the 4 ladies in waiting, and this final stage was without doubt the most picturesque. The president was not the only one whose tastes were depraved, his 3 friends, and especially Durset, were indeed a little tainted by his accursed, crapulous, and debauched mania which causes one to find a greater, more piquant attraction in an old, disgusting, and filthy object than in what nature has fashioned